Protists are one of the most divergent types of kingdoms that we're going to see. If we look at this scheme in terms of a phylogenetic tree, these little branches here, that's where things diverge. So for example, way back here, approximately 3.5 billion years ago, plus or minus a few million, is what we consider our last common universal ancestor. From there, we have a complete divergence in terms of where the domain eukarya will lie, and the other two domains, archaea and eukaryota. The other aspect that we're going to see is right in here. This is where we have the divergence of the last eukaryotic common ancestor. All organisms that diverge in this direction afterwards will be eukaryotic. Thus, they will have a membrane. They will surround their DNA, and they will have membrane-bound organelles. This is where we're going to find the kingdom Animalia, the kingdom Plantae, fungi, and the kingdom Protista. So all of these are essentially a little schematic with respect to the organisms in terms of life on Earth. The ones that we're concerned about in this little section would be that of the protists. So we're going to look at the eukaryotic cells that are perhaps the most complex, because one of the few things that they have in common is that they are indeed eukaryotic. So in terms of the protist diversity, some of these protists are photosynthetic, meaning that they can take carbon dioxide and water, these raw materials that are found abundantly on the earth, and make sugars. So in terms of being photosynthetic, they're going to be considered autotrophic. That is one thing that this group has in common. We might see, for example, a colonial organism such as the volvox. And in the volvox, it is a freshwater organism. It is going to have these specialized cells that are going to have some jobs, such as some of them might be specifically for their food-making processes, some of them might be for their reproduction processes, some of them might have these special flagella in order for movement. So the idea is we see this beginnings of an organization in terms of what we call a colonial being, or colonial organism. Other organisms, such as the euglena here, Euglena is a single-celled protist, and its main mechanism of movement would be that of flagella. You're going to see also this organism, euglena, when I talk about the heterotrophic protists, because the euglena, they have chloroplasts, thus they can photosynthesize. But for example, if they are in an area in which their sunlight is very dim or very rare, they can also shift into what we call being heterotrophic and subsequently eat their food. The other type of organism we might see, if you've ever been down, so for example in Carmel, we see these giant kelp. The giant kelp, it's actually a type of brown algae. So things such as seaweed, algae, kelp, these are all types of protists. We can't consider them true plants because they lack roots, stems, and leaves, and they also lack xylem and phloem. But here we have an example, in this case, of a multicellular protist, a single-celled protist, and a colonial protist. Very diverse. The one thing all of them have in common was that they are A, eukaryotic, and B, they are photosynthetic. Heterotrophic protists, they must consume or get their food. We have here the Vorticella. They have cilia around here, and they continue to move the cilia in a formation so that it creates a vortex to where small food, maybe even small paramecium, are ingested. These vorticella are subsequently heterotrophs. You're going to notice that the heterotrophs often lack coloration because they don't have that chlorophyll A or chlorophyll B that the photosynthetic animals have, or photosynthetic protists. And we also see that these protists have different ways of movement. The heterotrophic movements, they can be called the ciliates. Many of you are familiar with, for example, the paramecium, which move with the small hair-like structures called cilia. The flagellum is another mechanism by movement, and this is another example here in terms of the euglena. The other type of movement would be something called pseudopods, S-E-U-dopodia, or pseudopods. The amoeba has these pseudopods. So for example, you could see, which is really cool, the amoeba in this case is extending a couple of its pseudopods here to actually ingest. So this would be called phagocytosis, which is a form of endocytosis. Thus, remember, cell-eating cytosis. And so the pseudopods are moved and so that they will surround the food source and ultimately ingest the food. It will be bound with a lysosome and subsequently intracellular digestion can occur. The other thing that these organisms have to do is they have to struggle. So you can see here this structure called a contractile vacuole. The contractile vacuole is an adaptation of these freshwater organisms to live in fresh water, meaning that they are going to live in what we call a hypotonic environment. Thus, water would continually diffuse into this organism. But so that it does not rupture, the contractile vacuole is going to actively transport water out of the organism. So by contracting, it squeezes the water out and it pushes the water back into the environment. It's a continual process. These might contract every few seconds. Another type of organism would be that of the diatoms. These are small microscopic organisms that have a beautiful crystalline structure. Many of them can be phytoplankton, meaning that they are able to photosynthesize, but more importantly, their whole structure is based on this beautiful lattice of silica. The whole process of silica, you think about, we live in the Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley is basically the land from all of these dead organisms millions of years ago that laid down the silica crust. We were able to get the silicon and make computer chips and also a whole lot of Apple computers, as well as any type of Intel chips, etc. We're not going to get into all the name brands. But they also have chlorophyll, and we're going to see how chlorophyll is going to be a common characteristic and that we're going to see in terms of evolution in light of photosynthetic organisms. Last group of protists are the water molds and the slime molds. The water molds are more frequently found in terms of fresh water, and you probably have seen them. If you ever had a goldfish and it started to have this fuzzy-like appearance, this would be characteristic of a water mold. It's commonly called ick. I'm not sure where exactly it got that name. Maybe it looks icky. But the water mold would literally do this thing that all other types of fungi do. They secrete enzymes and they undergo what we call extracellular digestion. So like fungi, the water molds secrete enzymes to the outside. The enzymes break down the material, in this case it could be the protein of the scales, and subsequently digest their food and then absorb it. The other type of mold would be that what we call a slime mold. These don't require the need to live in water, but they do require a moist environment. You will often see them if you do have a compost pile at home. You can see that these will have a very vein-like structure as these slime molds continue to increase their mass and reproduce, and eventually they can cover this whole entire log here as long as there's moisture. If there is moisture, they will continue to reproduce asexually. However, if the moisture decreases, these will start to form these fruiting bodies and will dry up, and in these fruiting bodies they will have spores. The spores can be released like many fungi that we're going to look at, such as the mushroom or such as the black bread mold, and these spores then can reproduce once the favorable environment of a moist environment returns. So in conclusion, we could see here that these water molds and the slime molds, basically, some are going to be amoeboid-like. These will have filamentous. These are going to have cellulose with their cell walls. These might have chitin. So there might be differences with respect to how they are going to be structurally put together. The thing is that they can undergo either sexual reproduction and thus have genetic variation, or asexual reproduction when the environment is favorable. So in conclusion with the protists, they are all eukaryotic. Usually they are motile. They live in land, on land. They can live in fresh water. They can live in marine environments. If they are on land, they have to have at least a moist environment for that process of reproduction. But they are very diverse in terms of their ability to exist in a different type of environment. Some are heterotrophic, some are photosynthetic. They can be classified in terms of how they move, whether it's ciliates, whether it's flagella, or whether it's pseudopods. Remember how they obtain their food, so whether they are going to be heterotrophic or autotrophic. They are just a huge, diverse group of organisms to where I might look at them as the protists that are animal-like, or we can look at protists that are plant-like, or we can look at the protists that are fungi-like. It's thought that the various protists may well have led to the various kingdoms, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the fungi kingdom. So that's why I sometimes like to look at them as animal-like, plant-like, or fungi-like.